The storm came early. The kind that shakes rafters. Before the first drop of rain. He had arrived just before dusk. A visiting priest. Robe soaked from the road. Mud on the hem. Eyes quiet. He said little. Only that he would hear confessions. Before the vigil mass. They gave him the key. Lit the candles. Opened the wooden box. In the corner of the chapel. The old confessional. With the cracked panel. And the velvet curtain. Mended 3 times. By nightfall. The pews were empty. Only wind. Rattled the windows. But just as the priest began to close the booth, the door creaked open. A man stepped in. Hooded. Shaking slightly. And without greeting. Without kneeling. He began to confess. His voice was steady. Clear. Low. He named names. Sins that weren't his. Dates that didn't belong to him. And one by one, they matched pieces of the priest's own life. Things he had buried. Regrets no one knew. Years erased. When he left the monastery. 12 winters ago. When the confession ended, the man said, "Thank you, Brother Tomas." That name had not been spoken since the day he renounced it. The priest opened the panel. But the booth was empty. The door was still ajar. Just wide enough for candlelight to spill across the chapel floor. The priest stepped out slowly. One hand on the curtain. The other on the crucifix. Tucked beneath his robe. No one was there. Not in the pews. Not in the aisles. Not outside the chapel doors, which remained bolted against the wind. He moved to the entrance. Listened. Only rain now. But it hadn't started. When the voice first spoke. And the man who had said his name was gone. He whispered it to himself. For the first time in years. Brother Tomas. It didn't fit anymore. Not after Rome. Not after the vow he broke. Not after he stopped calling himself anything at all. He hadn't heard that name since the night he walked away from the monastery, where his brothers slept, while he chose silence over truth. And now, someone had dragged it back into the light. He checked the confessional again. Nothing. But in the wood, where the penitent had sat, he saw a mark. A small, scorched line. Beneath the varnish. Like something hot. Had touched the seat. Pressed. Then vanished. It smelled faintly of ashes and oil. He closed the chapel. And locked the doors behind him. But as he slid the bolt into place, he whispered the name. One more time. Not to remember it, but to see if it would answer. Morning came. The storm had passed. The villagers arrived for Mass. Early, as always. But the chapel doors wouldn't open. They pushed. Knocked. Called out. No sound inside. No movement. No flicker of candlelight through the windows. Brother Mateo tried the key. Twice. The lock turned. But the doors stayed closed. As if something inside refused to let go. They fetched the blacksmith. He brought a crowbar. A prayer. And 3 strong men. The bolt finally gave. The doors swung open. But what they found made all of them stop at once. The chapel was dark. Not empty, but still. The candles had burned low. Wax hardened mid-drip. The missal lay open. On the lectern. To a passage. None of them had read in years. He who forgives the unforgivable bears the weight not of sin, but of silence. There was no sign of the priest. His cloak remained folded over the first pew. His satchel unopened by the altar rail. But the confessional was split. The wood cracked down the center, as if something had pressed outward from within, and burned into the panel, where the penitent had once sat. He forgave what could not be forgiven. They closed the chapel for 3 days. No mass. No confessions. Only questions whispered. Outside locked doors. The bishop was summoned. He came quietly. With no entourage. Only his secretary. And a vial of holy oil. He examined the confessional. With gloved hands. Said nothing at first. Then, finally, murmured. This was not broken from the outside. The villagers leaned in. Waited. He ran his hand along the cracked panel. The one bearing the burned words. And said. Whatever left this, was inside. The mark in the wood was deeper than it looked. Not just scorched. Etched. Branded. As if the words had been carved. With something older than heat. They removed the panel. And behind it, tucked deep in the hollow of the confessional wall, was a scrap of torn cloth. It was black, frayed, and stained with oil and ash. The bishop didn't speak. He only placed it in a linen pouch, tied it shut, and told the villagers, "Do not enter the booth again." But the priest's belongings remained. His cloak. His satchel. And inside it, a single folded letter. Sealed with wax. No address. No signature. Only a word pressed into the seal. Tomas. They broke the seal. At dusk. The bishop had waited. Not out of fear. But because something about the letter felt unfinished. The wax was fresh. Still soft around the edges. As if pressed only hours before. But no one had seen the priest since the storm. And the chapel had been locked from the inside. When the parchment unfolded, it revealed no greeting. No date. Just a name. Written in sharp, uneven ink. At the top of the page. Tomas. His old name. The one he had abandoned. After the monastery. After the silence. Beneath it. 7 lines. No corrections. No hesitation. As if dictated. By something that would not wait. I took a sin not my own. I spoke mercy over a wound I did not cause. I opened a door I had once closed in fear. He knew the name I buried. He knew the silence I carried. I did not forgive him. I forgave myself. The bishop read the letter 3 times. Each time, he paused longer. On the final sentence. Each time, the candles burned lower. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. On the 6th day, they reopened the chapel. Quietly. No announcement. No procession. Only the bishop, a few elders, and a single acolyte, sent to relight the candles. When they stepped inside, everything looked untouched. The pews were clean. The altar dressed. The missal still open. To the same page. But the confessional had changed. There was no door. Not broken. Not removed. Gone. The hinges remained. The frame intact. But the door itself had vanished. And carved into the threshold, just below where the wood had been, the seal remains. The bishop did not touch it. Instead, he walked slowly to the front of the chapel and knelt. He didn't speak. But those who stood behind him swore later. They saw something shift in the light near the crucifix. Not a figure. Not a shadow. Just the faint outline of a man kneeling. And then nothing. They left the door open after that. Not because it was safe. Not because it was understood. But because some doors are never meant to be closed again. The bishop didn't sleep that night. He remained in the rectory, seated by the small chapel window, watching the candlelight flicker from behind the altar. At midnight, he heard it. 3 knocks on the confessional wall. Not the door. Not the floorboards. The wall. Just like the old story said. He rose and crossed the chapel alone. The pews whispered as he passed. Not with sound, but memory. When he reached the booth, he placed his hand where the door had once been. It was warm. And inside, laid neatly on the bench where the penitent once sat, was the priest's rosary. Unburned. Unbroken. Still looped from his final Massachusetts. There was no note this time. No ash. No name. Just one new thing. Scratched so faintly into the back wall that it could only be seen in the right angle of candlelight. It was never his sin. By morning, the villagers knew. The man who entered the confessional had never come to confess. He came to return something. And the priest had carried what he couldn't give back. They say the chapel is quieter now. Not empty. Not abandoned. Just listening. The confessional was never rebuilt. Not because they feared it, but because no one dared replace what had been carried away. The booth still stands. Doorless. Untouched. And once a year, on the night of the storm, someone always hears it. 3 knocks. A soft creak of wood. And the whisper of a voice. No one remembers. Saying a name. No one uses. Tomas. No one ever saw the priest again. No grave. No letter. No sign of his return. Only that final note. Tucked inside his psalter. Left beside the broken booth. It was not forgiveness I offered. It was the silence I had denied. And from that year forward, no one confessed alone. Another sat nearby, praying not for mercy, but for the memory of the one who dared to carry a sin that did not belong to him.